Alright, today I'm putting together a complete guide on explaining the ins and outs on if dumpers are afraid to contact their exes. Now, in short, it's my belief that most dumpers are actually not afraid to contact their exes. Instead, usually what's happening is they're simply falling victim to their natural avoidant tendencies, which makes most people think that they're afraid of contacting them. Now, some of you may hear that and think, well, what about a situation where the dumper simply wants nothing to do with their ex? And certainly those kind of situations do exist. But even in those cases, I think understanding how the avoidant attachment style plays a role in what's going on with the dumper can be really illuminating. After all, the avoidant will, well, they'll avoid. So let's first begin by talking about why most people think dumpers are afraid to contact an ex. You, if you're watching this and are interested in this topic, you've been broken up with. Maybe it's been a few months since the breakup event, and in all that time, maybe potentially your ex hasn't contacted you. You may have reached out a few times, just trying to be nice, of course, and you've received no response. And it sometimes can feel as if they don't think you exist, or you're left wondering if your time together meant anything to them. It did, don't worry. But what's going on here? Is your ex afraid to rehash the past? Why won't they talk to you? Well, recently, Coach Tyler and I conducted a really interesting interview where we talked about the dynamics of dismissive avoidance. So basically, and this is extremely relevant to this conversation, but basically we're doing this interview conversation where we were talking about the stages that a dismissive avoidant will go through if you're using a no contact rule on them. And he said something in the interview that really stuck with me. Basically, the gist was like this, right? If you go through a breakup with a dismissive avoidant, it's almost like they began to cease all contact with their exes immediately after the breakup. And you're going to find that the dismissive avoidant will completely drop off the map. So, in other words, while you are using a no contact rule on them, they're kind of using their own no contact rule on you. In some rare instances, they may poke in a time or two just to check up on you, but that'll be it. They're out. Why are they doing this? Well, I think it all stems from an understanding of the core wound of an attachment style. So according to the tenets of attachment theory, everyone has an attachment style, but those that have insecure ones are usually that insecurities formed from this idea of a core wound. That's a lot to swallow, so I'm just going to kind of matrix this down a little bit for you. There are two types of attachment styles. There are secure attachment styles and insecure attachment styles. We're not going to really talk about secure attachment styles because guess what? Secure people are not the kind of people that will necessarily be making you think they're afraid to contact you. Usually they'll inform you ahead of time as opposed to just dropping off the map. So that leaves insecure attachment styles to really take a look at. And when you're looking at insecure attachment styles, there are three types of insecure attachment styles: anxious, dismissive avoidant, and fearful avoidant. Now I know it gets a little bit confusing with the terminology, but I'm going to give you a pretty quick cheat sheet whenever you get confused about this. Simply by understanding the core wounds of each attachment style, it's going to tell you a lot about their MO. For example, the anxious attachment style's core wound revolves around them being terrified of being alone or abandoned. So a lot of times what triggers them is something related to that. So using a breakup as an example, well, anxious people often get triggered during breakups because their worst fear has just come true. They've been left alone. Now, the dismissive avoidant core wound is a little bit more interesting. So dismissive avoidants are really afraid of losing their independence in relationships. So one of the things that I talk about on my YouTube channel and on my website a lot is this idea of the self-fulfilling avoidance cycle, and how each avoidant you deal with in life goes through this self-fulfilling cycle where they want someone to love them. They find you, they think their troubles are over, then they start noticing some worrying things, they self-sabotage, they start thinking of leaving, they've left the relationship, and then they're happy that they left the relationship, and then the loneliness begins to sit in, and they sit there wondering, why can't I ever find the right person? Why is this always happening to me? And guess what? Around and around they go in this cycle. And this really stems from this idea of they're terrified of losing their independence. So really where things go wrong with many dismissive avoidants is they start noticing some worrying things in their relationship, and those worrying things are usually things that make them feel like they're going to lose their independence. Now, dismissive avoidants are also interesting for another reason. They're caught between this paradox of desperately craving a deep love but also not wanting to let anyone close enough to tread on that independence. Now, I don't want to go too far into fearful avoidance because essentially fearful avoidance are the worst of both worlds. They have both anxious and avoidant tendencies. So we're just going to focus on dismissive avoidance for right now because it's going to help us understand if your dumping ex is afraid to contact you. Understanding this basic principle about dismissive avoidance gives you a lot of insight into why they are so distant after they break up with you. In their mind, they just got free from a relationship. They have all these preconceived notions about you, potentially that you're anxious or that you're going to overreact, and they don't want to engage you to rehash any of those. So ultimately, after they dump you, they actually will find it easier not to reach out to you at all. Now, some may read this as fear, and maybe that's a little true, but I think for most avoidant dumpers, it's simply more convenient not to talk to you because they don't want to use or they don't want to relive any of that self-imposed trauma, which leads me to the next point. I believe that avoidant dumpers eventually are overcome with nostalgia. Now, I have been classified as a dismissive avoidant. I took all the tests, and I always went in the arrogance of me going in and thinking, well, I'm a secure attachment style. Nope, dismissive avoidant. You can take the test on, I think it's attachmentproject.com, has a pretty decent test. There's tons of little tests out there that will tell you what your attachment style is. I think I'm pretty self-aware, but when I've been told that I'm dismissive avoidant, I start to look at some of my past behaviors and think, that makes a little bit more sense now. That's why I didn't do that. That's why I didn't do that. I'm working on it, okay? No judgment. So I don't want to get too off topic, but I've come to realize that most avoidants eventually, if you give them enough time, can be overcome with nostalgia. I talk a lot about this concept in one of our most famous videos, which is how to make an avoidant ex miss you. So the premise of the strategy is basically after stumbling across research and studying our success stories, I began noticing this really interesting trend. So when we had clients move on from their exes, we started noticing their exes started coming back when our clients are moving on from them. Now, I know that's not exactly like the most revolutionary advice, right? I'm sitting here and saying like, hey, if you want to get your ex back or you want your ex to fawn over you, you need to get over them. But that's kind of what we found. But what's really interesting is that we know pure avoidant exes tend to be overcome with nostalgia when they feel safe enough to fawn over their exes. And the irony is they only usually feel safe if a couple of things have happened. Number one, you've either moved on from them completely. Number two, they've moved on from you completely. Or number three, a lot of time has gone by. So avoidance will often fall victim to this phantom ex syndrome, something I've talked a lot about on the website and on the YouTube channel. So if you're not familiar with what that is, I suggest you watch some of our other videos. Now, the perfect setup for an avoidant is for them to covet a relationship with someone that they literally won't have to commit to. So as a dismissive avoidant, has this ever happened to me? Well, yes, it has. So I'm going to tell you a real life story of breakup nostalgia and its impact on real life actions that I took. So I'm going to tell you a story of a breakup I went through. I was the dumper in the breakup. I broke up with her after dating her for 9 months. Now, I'd classify this relationship similar to that of a shooting star. Parts were fraught with excitement and new experiences, but ultimately those memories were fleeting. Most of the relationship was basically us just fighting the entire time. And eventually I had enough. That was it for me. I'm out of here. So I broke up with her. Over text, no less. I know. Pretty bad. But hey, I'm 32 now, and at the time I was, I think, in my early 20s, so I was just a kid still. All right, anyway, so I break up with her. Months go by, and I literally am at the point where I'm like, I don't even want to talk to her. And I think the reasoning for why I did not want to talk to her had more to do with the fact that I just associated her with pain and arguments and fighting. Then something really funny happened. Nostalgia happened. So looking back at it, I feel like I was really falling victim to this concept we call the peak end rule. Now, if you aren't familiar with the peak end rule, it's basically the psychological concept studying memory. And essentially, it argues that human beings are really not great at remembering the entirety of experiences. So we come up with these coping memory mechanisms. And one of the ways we tag memories is by associating them with two distinct points: the peak moments and the end moments. Now, peak moments can be peak positive or peak negative, or end positive and end negative. You get the point. So what ended up happening in this relationship is, after enough time went by, I stopped thinking of the end moments and started only thinking of the peak moments. I started remembering all those really exciting times we had together. Yeah, it's not like I didn't think about the fact that we fought a lot, but I felt certain that the moments that we had that were the high moments were kind of unmatched. It kind of trumped the fighting. And I started fixating on that. And that's when nostalgia kicked in for me in a really heavy way. So much so that I actually decided I was going to execute like this crazy grand gesture to try to restart the relationship. I was going to try to get my ex back. Months and months have gone by, and I just come up with this crazy plan. So at the time, she was in college. I was in college. We went to separate colleges. But during our relationship, one of the things that I would do so we get more time, I was going to wake up early. I was going to go drive to her college. I was going to find her and talk with her and win her back. Now, here's a little context. I had no idea what her schedule was. When we were dating, I did. I knew where she was going to be. I knew that she was taking classes at this time. And so I just kind of banked all of this on the pretend scenario that she took classes at the same exact time that she did the previous year. So I had no idea what her schedule was like. And we've been broken up for a long time. I knew she was still going to the school. You can see that through Facebook updates, but I just kind of, I guess, figured I was going to figure everything out when I'm there. It was kind of a spur of the moment plan. And when I was sort of thinking of this and decided to tell the story on YouTube, and it's going to make me really embarrassed in a minute, it really made me think of that interview I did with Coach Tyler. And he started talking about one of the dismissive avoidant things is the nostalgia aspect. And he said something specifically that ringed really poignant for me when it came to nostalgia. Many exes that are dealing with nostalgia or get hit with nostalgia, they go through this aggressive reapproach stage where seemingly out of the blue, they contacting you, wanting to revisit things, and they want to go really fast. And often this is happening because nostalgia takes over, and for a moment, the avoidant person grows anxious. So what happened with me and my ex? Well, I basically did the exact plan. I went to bed super early. I woke up at 5 a.m. I hopped in my car. I drove to her college and waited for the classes to start. So I'm there waiting. I'm looking for her. Hours go by, and I start to get that uneasy feeling. I'm looking like a creep. I haven't found her, and I'm just wandering around aimlessly. And at some point, I start thinking to myself, what am I doing? I eventually said this to myself, and eventually that was what convinced me to get in my car and drive away. But I did go, and I was embarrassed, and I was driven by the power of nostalgia. Now, what can we learn from my story? Well, in my opinion, there are two main morals to the story. Number one, avoidant individuals usually will at some point have a period of nostalgia. And number two, sometimes that nostalgia can happen quickly and out of the blue. So personally, when coaching individuals, I see this happen a lot, specifically with avoidant exes. It just so happens that many of our clients' exes happen to be avoidant by nature, which explains why I'm seeing it happen a lot. Now, one of the things that I think is important is usually it only works if you are at a place emotionally where you kind of don't want to get your ex back anymore. And so a lot of the work that we have been shifting towards, and some of our clients unfortunately just don't get it, a lot of our work is shifting towards helping people not necessarily not want their exes back, but remove their ex off the pedestal so that their ex isn't number one for them anymore. Maybe they're number 2 or 3 or 4 on the pedestal hierarchy. And so I think no matter what situation you find yourself in, to answer your question ultimately, are dumpers afraid to contact their exes? I don't think they are. I think more than anything, they're avoiding you because of the core wounds they have as an avoidant potential personality. I also think it's more convenient for them not to talk to you as opposed to talking and trying to revisit some of those feelings. But at a certain time, I do find that exes tend to reach out if you leave them alone. It's a different story if you're overly anxious and you try to force their hand a little bit. But you're not going to do that because you're trained by yours truly.